He was the greatest smith of his age, grandson of Fëanor himself, and creator of the Rings of Power. But after Sauron's armies stormed his realm, Celebrimbor vanished, leaving behind only fragments of his story and one of Tolkien's darkest mysteries. What truly became of him? Before we journey further into the story, if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, it would help us bring more tales from Arda to life. Now, let's return to the story. To understand Celebrimbor, we must first comprehend the world that shaped him. The Second Age of Middle-earth was a time of cautious hope, a fragile renaissance following the ruin of Beleriand and the devastating wars of the First Age. The Elves, those survivors of cataclysm, were scarred by past hubris. Into this precarious peace stepped Celebrimbor, heir to the genius and brilliance of Fëanor, yet tempered with a more measured vision. His realm, Eregion, lay near the gates of Khazad-dûm, a valley of lush forests and deep rivers where elves and dwarves traded skills and knowledge. It was here that Celebrimbor gathered the Gwaith-i-Mírdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, forming a community devoted to craft at its purest. They were not merely artisans, they were philosophers of metal, stone, and light, blending practicality with artistry in a way unseen since the First Age. Eregion became a beacon of creative genius. Celebrimbor's vision was not solely for wealth or weaponry. He sought to capture beauty itself, to encapsulate the enduring essence of the world in his creations. Every gem cut, every ring forged, was an exploration of form, function, and meaning. Scholars of Tolkien's works note that Celebrimbor's approach reflects the enduring theme of the Elves, to create in harmony with the world rather than dominate it. Yet, even within this idyllic realm, shadows lingered. The lingering fear of Morgoth's shadow, though banished, persisted in the hearts of the Elves, reminding them that great skill and ambition always carried risk. It was into this environment of cautious optimism that Sauron, ever the deceiver, arrived in fair form as Onatar, the Lord of Gifts. He presented himself as a teacher, a benign guide, offering knowledge to enhance the works of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain. Tolkien makes it clear that Sauron's seduction was subtle, a mix of charm and strategic insight. He did not command through force alone. He offered a vision of progress, of elvish craft perfected. Yet Celebrimbor, unlike many of his followers, sensed a hidden darkness beneath this honeyed rhetoric. He perceived the shadow in Onatar's counsel, a corruption that threatened the very heart of Eregion. This foresight would become central to his legacy. Yet, even in this zenith of accomplishment, danger loomed. The tale of Celebrimbor is not simply one of craft and artistry, but a study in the delicate balance between creation and corruption, trust and treachery. His choices, from forging the rings to resisting Sauron's coercion, illuminate the moral and philosophical complexities of the Second Age. Celebrimbor's story asks the enduring question: can brilliance survive in a world where ambition is weaponized, where evil wears the guise of benevolence? And so, the stage was set. Celebrimbor, the master smith, stood at the intersection of genius and peril, his hands shaping the destiny of Middle-earth, even as the shadow of Sauron stretched ever closer. His life would soon become a crucible of morality, courage, and endurance, and ultimately, one of Tolkien's most haunting enigmas. Celebrimbor was no ordinary elf. To understand him, we must first understand the weight of his bloodline. He was the grandson of Fëanor, the greatest of the Noldor craftsmen, whose fire and ambition forged the Silmarils, the jewels that held the very light of the two trees of Valinor. Fëanor's legacy was one of brilliance and tragedy, genius intertwined with pride, creation entwined with catastrophe. Celebrimbor inherited this legacy, not merely in his skill with hammer and anvil, but in the moral and philosophical dilemmas it carried. Unlike Fëanor, whose ambition often blinded him, Celebrimbor sought mastery without surrendering to hubris. Yet even this restraint was a tightrope walk. The shadow of his grandfather's temperament lingered as a cautionary whisper through the ages. Yet lineage alone does not explain Celebrimbor's greatness. His approach to craft was philosophical, almost spiritual. Each ring forged under his supervision was an exploration of principle as much as form. The 3 rings, later hidden from Sauron, exemplify this. Vilya, Nenya, and Narya were designed not to dominate, but to heal, protect, and inspire. Here we see Celebrimbor's ethical vision, that power, when wielded with wisdom, can preserve the good in the world rather than amplify tyranny. Scholars of Tolkien's work often highlight this as a defining trait, contrasting Celebrimbor with other Noldoran figures who allowed pride to override foresight. His creations were more than tools. They were moral instruments, reflections of his understanding of duty, consequence, and the fragility of light in a world shadowed by evil. The legacy of Celebrimbor is also evident in the scope of his ambition. Unlike many of his peers who focused on wealth or prestige, he sought the perfection of craft itself. Each innovation, each refinement built upon centuries of Elvish knowledge, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. It was this combination of intellectual rigor, moral insight, and technical mastery that Celebrimbor apart. A craftsman who understood that true greatness required more than skill. It demanded foresight, patience, and ethical clarity. Yet, even at the pinnacle of achievement, there were whispers of danger. The memory of Morgoth's deceit and the tragic consequences of Fëanor's ambition hung over Eregion. Celebrimbor's awareness of this history was not theoretical. It informed every choice, every decision, every design. His lineage provided both power and burden, a double-edged inheritance that demanded vigilance. In a way, Celebrimbor's story is as much about restraint as it is about brilliance, about knowing when to create boldly and when to shield the work from corruption. Through this lens, we see that Celebrimbor's legacy is not merely a catalog of objects or a list of achievements. It is a study in the interplay between talent, ethics, and historical consciousness. His life demonstrates that mastery carries responsibility, that creation without reflection can become a conduit for disaster, and that even the brightest mind must contend with forces beyond its control. The Gwaith-i-Mírdain, under his leadership, were the embodiment of this philosophy, a testament to the enduring power of skill guided by conscience. And so, as Celebrimbor prepared to face the greatest test of his life, the foundations of Eregion, the Gwaith-i-Mírdain, and his own moral compass were all poised on the precipice of an extraordinary and catastrophic confrontation. The stage was set not only for the forging of objects of unparalleled beauty, but for decisions that would resonate across ages, shaping the fate of Middle-earth itself.
Then came Annatar, the fair form of Sauron, cloaked in honeyed words and the guise of a benefactor. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, offering knowledge that seemed to elevate the work of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain. Tolkien emphasizes the subtlety of his deception. Annatar did not strike with open force, but with intellect, charm, and the promise of shared wisdom. To the Elves of Eregion, already masters of their craft, his teachings seemed a natural progression, a chance to achieve perfection previously unattainable. Yet Celebrimbor, ever cautious and perceptive, discerned the shadow beneath the words, sensing that what was offered bore the mark of domination rather than enlightenment. Under Annatar's guidance, the smiths of Eregion began to forge rings of power. These were not ordinary rings. They were conduits of the maker's skill and the world's natural energy. Tolkien's texts describe them as instruments intended to heal, preserve, and enhance. The 7 for the dwarf lords, the 9 for mortal men, each designed with specific intent, were gifts that could, in lesser hands, become instruments of control. It was in this crucible of creation and temptation that Celebrimbor made a choice that would define his legacy. He secretly forged the 3 rings, the greatest of all. Vilya, the ring of air, Nenya, the ring of water, and Narya, the ring of fire, each a vessel of power, untouched by Sauron's malevolent influence. The technical and philosophical aspects of these rings reveal the depth of Celebrimbor's genius. Vilya, with its sapphire, could preserve lands and heal the scars of time. Nenya, wrought from adamant, protected and maintained what it touched, embodying the elves' desire to shield and nurture. Narya, set with a ruby, inspired courage and resistance against despair. The very act of forging these rings in secret demonstrates not only technical mastery, but moral foresight. Celebrimbor understood that knowledge in the wrong hands could corrupt, and that vigilance must accompany creation. Scholars of Tolkien's legendarium note that the 3 rings represent the highest synthesis of skill, ethics, and understanding of the metaphysical properties of Arda itself. Yet, the act of creation was fraught with peril. Forging rings of such magnitude demanded alignment with cosmic forces, a precise blending of skill and insight. The slightest misstep could channel corruption instead of preservation. Celebrimbor, aware of these dangers, worked with meticulous care, employing techniques lost to history and methods that required both intellectual discipline and spiritual harmony. Every hammer strike, every mold, every enchantment was deliberate, a careful negotiation with the inherent power of the materials and the world they were part of. The moral tension in this endeavor cannot be overstated. Sauron's intent was domination, a perversion of creative energy into control and tyranny. Celebrimbor's response was the antithesis: creation for preservation, knowledge safeguarded against abuse. In this act, we see the recurring Tolkienian theme of choice and consequence, that even the greatest gifts can become instruments of evil if wielded without wisdom. However, secrecy alone could not guarantee safety. The very act of resisting Sauron placed Eregion in jeopardy. The forging of the 3 rings was not merely an artistic statement. It was an ethical stance, a declaration that some knowledge must be shielded from corruption. By taking this risk, Celebrimbor set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in war, suffering, and his own capture. The rings were simultaneously instruments of hope and flashpoints of inevitable conflict. In forging these rings, Celebrimbor exemplified the profound responsibility inherent in mastery. Craft, Tolkien suggests, is never neutral. It shapes the moral and physical fabric of the world. Each choice, each strike of the hammer, carries ramifications that extend beyond the immediate realm. And so, as the 3 rings were completed in secret, Celebrimbor stood at the threshold of catastrophe. Sauron's patience was finite, his designs relentless. The stage was set for confrontation, for betrayal, and for a test that would put even the greatest smith of Eregion to the limits of endurance, courage, and moral fortitude. When the truth of Anatar was revealed, it struck like a thunderbolt across the halls of Eregion. Sauron, the Dark Lord in disguise, no longer sought to teach or persuade. He sought dominion, pure and absolute. The veneer of generosity fell away, exposing a will bent on enslavement and destruction. Tolkien's accounts make it clear that this was not merely a political or military maneuver. It was a profound moral violation. The elves had been seduced by knowledge, and the cost of that seduction was swift and merciless. Sauron's armies swept across Eregion with calculated precision. Orcs, men corrupted by dark allegiance, and other foul creatures descended upon the valley, laying waste to homes, workshops, and the dreams of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain. Celebrimbor, despite his skill and foresight, was unable to prevent the calamity. His realm, once a beacon of beauty and craft, became a field of fire and ruin. Tolkien presents this moment as a turning point in the Second Age, the triumph of deception over trust, of brute force over artistry. The fall of Eregion demonstrates the vulnerability of even the wisest to malice cloaked in charm. Amid the chaos, Celebrimbor himself was captured. His fate now hung by a thread, yet it was a thread woven of courage and defiance. Sauron sought the Three Rings, the secret heart of elvish power. The Dark Lord's method of interrogation was brutal, a combination of physical torment and psychological manipulation. Tolkien's texts are intentionally sparse on the exact details, leaving scholars to infer the extremes of suffering. What is clear, however, is that Celebrimbor's will remained partially unbroken. He revealed the locations of the 7 and 9 rings, yet the 3 remained secret. In this act, he demonstrated both strategic wisdom and unwavering moral resolve, preserving a glimmer of hope for the free peoples of Middle-earth. The immediate consequences of this betrayal were catastrophic. Eregion lay in ruins, its people scattered, its dreams of collaboration and creation extinguished. The smiths who survived were forced to flee, carrying with them knowledge, grief, and the weight of what had been lost. For Middle-earth at large, the fall of Eregion signaled the resurgence of darkness in a new, insidious form. Not merely an open enemy, but a force capable of deceit, seduction, and the subversion of virtue. Celebrimbor's capture became a symbol of both the cost of resistance and the moral stakes of mastery. There is a philosophical resonance in this episode. Tolkien repeatedly frames the Second Age as a time when choices, even those made with the best intentions, could invite ruin. Celebrimbor's decision to forge the Three Rings, to hide them from Sauron, was ethically correct, yet it precipitated immense suffering. This tension between righteous action and unintended consequence permeates the narrative. Celebrimbor embodies the dilemma of the artist and the moral agent: how to act rightly when the forces arrayed against virtue are both cunning and merciless. Even after his capture, Celebrimbor's defiance shaped history. By withholding knowledge of the Three Rings, he ensured their survival, allowing them to later become instruments of resistance against Sauron's tyranny. This is not merely a story of personal courage, it is a lesson in the enduring power of foresight, discipline, and moral integrity. Tolkien's emphasis on the secrecy and protection of the Three Rings underscores a recurring motif. The preservation of good often requires sacrifice, and the greatest triumphs may be unseen by contemporaries. The betrayal of Sauron thus serves multiple layers of narrative and philosophical function. On one level, it is the climactic turning point of Celebrimbor's life, the moment when skill, courage, and ethical commitment collide with overwhelming force. On another, it illustrates Tolkien's meditation on the nature of evil, subtle, seductive, and destructive. And finally, it sets the stage for the enduring mystery of Celebrimbor's fate, a silence that has haunted scholars and readers alike for generations. As Eregion burned and the Dark Lord's shadow spread, Celebrimbor's story entered the realm of enigma. His choices, his resistance, and his ultimate disappearance created a legacy that would shape both the physical and moral landscape of Middle-earth. The question remained,
What became of the greatest smith of the Second Age once the armies of Sauron had swept through his domain? The answer, as we shall see, is shrouded in torment, heroism, and unresolved mystery.
In the dark depths of Sauron's dungeons, Celebrimbor endured what no other elf had faced: the calculated, relentless torment of the Dark Lord himself. Tolkien's accounts provide only fragments, yet the implications are profound. This was not mere physical pain, though that was undoubtedly severe. It was a trial of the mind, the spirit, and the ethical resolve of one of Middle-earth's greatest beings. Sauron sought the Three Rings, instruments that could shape the very fate of the world, and he applied every conceivable method to extract their secrets. Yet Celebrimbor resisted. Under torture, he revealed the locations of the 7 rings for the Dwarf Lords and the 9 for men, understanding that the Dark Lord's dominion could not be fully averted. Still, the 3 remained hidden. This act was both strategic and moral, a calculated preservation of power for the sake of free peoples, even at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Here, Tolkien presents a profound meditation on courage. True heroism is not always visible, and often the most consequential actions are those performed silently under the shadow of overwhelming threat. The nature of Celebrimbor's resistance raises questions about the intersection of skill, will, and ethics. A master smith, he understood that knowledge could be weaponized. A misstep in disclosure could shift the balance of the Second Age irrevocably toward tyranny. In refusing to yield the 3, he was exercising the ultimate restraint, a demonstration that mastery carries moral responsibility. Scholars note that this aligns with a recurring Tolkienian theme: the ethical obligation of the gifted to protect what they have created, not for personal gain, but for the preservation of good against corruption. The psychological dimension of his endurance is equally significant. Sauron's methods were designed to break not only the body, but the mind, to subvert pride and hope into despair and obedience. Yet Celebrimbor's fortitude reflects an extraordinary alignment of intellect and spirit. He combined the analytical rigor of a master craftsman with the moral clarity of a conscience tempered by foresight. In essence, his defiance was an extension of his craft, precise, deliberate, and attuned to the subtle currents of consequence. Tolkien's text implies that this resistance was costly. The torment inflicted may have shattered his body, fractured his spirit, or at the very least left him in a state of extreme vulnerability. Accounts diverge on what ultimately became of him. Some claim he was slain outright. Others suggest his body was desecrated and displayed before the gates of Eregion, a grim warning to all who would resist. What remains undisputed is that his silence preserved the 3 rings, ensuring that the instruments of preservation and resistance would survive long after his capture. This endurance carries profound philosophical weight. Celebrimbor's actions challenge the notion that power is inherently corrupting. Here is a figure whose skill and insight were matched with ethical commitment, who recognized the catastrophic potential of his creations and chose to act with courage even at the cost of his own life. In Tolkien's broader legendarium, such acts of defiance under duress are emblematic of the tension between free will and destiny, demonstrating that even against overwhelming evil, principled action can shape the course of history. Moreover, Celebrimbor's resistance has lasting implications for the narrative arc of Middle-earth. By safeguarding the 3 rings, he ensured that Elvish power would endure in the West, providing a bulwark against Sauron's domination. The rings later aided Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan in preserving realms of resistance, allowing hope to persist through the ages of shadow. This is a critical narrative point. The survival of the 3 rings, and therefore the survival of key centers of resistance, directly hinges upon Celebrimbor's moral and technical mastery under extreme duress. In essence, the torture and defiance of Celebrimbor exemplify the interplay of mastery, morality, and resilience. His story transcends mere biography. It becomes a study in ethical courage, the preservation of beauty and knowledge against obliteration, and the enduring power of foresight. Through suffering, he exercised the ultimate act of creation, the protection of what he had forged and the safeguarding of the future. And yet, even after this ultimate act of courage, the question remains hauntingly unresolved. What became of Celebrimbor once Sauron's purpose had been served? This silence, this absence, is what transforms his story from tragedy to enigma, leaving scholars, elves, and readers alike to grapple with the consequences of brilliance, resistance, and the unknown.
And then, nothing certain. After Celebrimbor's capture and defiance, the record of his fate becomes fragmented, inconsistent, and deeply unsettling. Tolkien himself offers tantalizing glimpses, yet never a definitive answer. Some accounts claim he was slain in torment, his life extinguished beneath the cruel hand of Sauron. Others suggest a more grotesque end, that his broken body was displayed before the gates of Eregion, a grim trophy meant to cow the surviving smiths and the elves of the West. Scholars have debated these variations for decades, noting that Tolkien's deliberate ambiguity serves both narrative and philosophical purposes. It transforms Celebrimbor's life from a story of mastery into a study of mystery, of unresolved moral and historical tension. The contradictions in the texts reveal as much as the events themselves. In the Silmarillion, the chroniclers focus on the aftermath, the scattering of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain, the loss of Eregion, and the survival of the Three Rings, rather than on the fate of the smith. In the unfinished tales, additional fragments hinted horror and defilement, yet avoid specificity. By withholding the final fate of Celebrimbor, Tolkien creates a moral and psychological resonance. The unknown amplifies the weight of his resistance, and the silence itself becomes part of the story. The unresolved nature of his end forces readers to confront uncertainty, to dwell in the tension between courage and destruction, between knowledge and annihilation. This ambiguity has invited diverse interpretations. Some scholars argue that Celebrimbor's disappearance symbolizes the elves' broader vulnerability in the Second Age, that even the greatest genius is not immune to the consequences of history and deceit. Others suggest a more heroic reading, that his body may have been obliterated, but his spirit and influence persisted in the survival of the Three Rings. The narrative's gaps, far from diminishing his importance, enhance the legend, turning a historical figure into a mythic exemplar of endurance, moral clarity, and the consequences of choices under duress. There is also a cultural dimension to these conflicting accounts. Among the elves, the story of Celebrimbor may have been deliberately left ambiguous to serve as both cautionary tale and inspiration. His courage under torture, his ethical restraint, and his technical genius become larger than any single fate. They transform into enduring principles for those who survived and for the generations to come. The unresolved nature of his end mirrors the uncertainty faced by all who resist tyranny. Victory is never guaranteed, and the price of defiance can remain unknown. The conflicting accounts also underscore the stakes of the Second Age. Eregion, the Gwaith-i-Mírdain, and the Three Rings exist in a delicate balance between preservation and corruption. The ambiguity of Celebrimbor's death serves as a narrative reflection of this balance, that light and hope are never absolute, that triumph and suffering often coexist, and that history is rarely a simple ledger of deeds. In this way, Tolkien elevates Celebrimbor's story beyond biography into a meditation on fate, morality, and the enduring struggle between shadow and light. Ultimately, the uncertainty surrounding Celebrimbor is inseparable from his legacy. The very act of disappearing, of leaving no grave, no final testament, reinforces the tension between human action and cosmic consequence. It poses profound questions. Does heroism require survival? Can courage retain its value if the hero's end is unknown? And what does it mean to preserve the good in a world that may never witness the fruits of that preservation? Tolkien invites us to wrestle with these questions precisely because he does not provide a neat resolution. Even in death, or disappearance, Celebrimbor exerts influence. The survival of the Three Rings, the dispersal and eventual regrouping of Elvish craft, and the ongoing struggle against Sauron's dominion all hinge on choices made in that moment of extreme duress. The conflicting accounts of his fate, far from diminishing his story, amplifies its mythic resonance, a tale of brilliance, courage, and moral complexity suspended in the shadow of the unknown. As we move forward, it is into this silence that we step. The aftermath of Eregion's fall, the scattering of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain, and the hidden preservation of the Three Rings all emerge as consequences of Celebrimbor's defiance. Consequences that would shape the course of Middle-earth for centuries to come.
With Celebrimbor gone, the consequences for Eregion and the broader world of Middle-earth were immediate and devastating. The once thriving realm of jewelsmiths, a pinnacle of elvish artistry and innovation, was left in ruins. Sauron's armies had swept through its forests and valleys, leaving fire, ash, and death in their wake. Survivors of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain fled, carrying fragments of their knowledge and their grief into exile. What had been a community defined by collaboration, creativity, and ethical mastery became a dispersed diaspora, a shadow of its former brilliance. Tolkien emphasizes that this collapse was not merely physical, it represented the disintegration of cultural and moral cohesion. The destruction of Eregion was a blow not just to craftsmanship, but to the very ideals it embodied: openness, learning, and the harmonization of skill with conscience. Yet, even in this devastation, the Three Rings endured, hidden and protected. Celebrimbor's foresight had ensured that Sauron, despite his power, could not touch the instruments designed to preserve and protect. The survival of Vilya, Nenya, and Narya would prove pivotal, anchoring centers of resistance in an age increasingly dominated by shadow. Elrond, Círdan, and Galadriel, heirs to Celebrimbor's vision and guardians of his legacy, would use these rings to safeguard Rivendell, Lothlorien, and the western coasts, preserving pockets of light and culture against the encroaching darkness. In this way, the impact of Celebrimbor's defiance extended far beyond his personal fate. It shaped the very geography of hope in Middle-earth. The dispersal of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain also had long-term consequences for Elvish craft. Tolkien notes that while the technical knowledge survived in fragments, the cohesive culture that had fostered such unparalleled artistry was lost. The smiths who escaped were forced into secrecy, their skills scattered among the remaining free peoples. This fragmentation mirrors a recurring theme in Tolkien's work: the fragility of knowledge and culture in the face of malevolent power, and the delicate tension between creation and destruction. Celebrimbor's vision persisted, but only in glimpses, preserved in hidden works, scattered expertise, and the moral example of those who survived. Beyond the practical consequences, the aftermath of Erion's fall illustrates a moral and philosophical dimension central to Celebrimbor's story. His actions, culminating in resistance under torture, demonstrate the profound costs of ethical integrity. The preservation of the Three Rings required not only brilliance and skill, but endurance in the face of overwhelming evil. The suffering of the smiths, the destruction of their homes, and the scattering of knowledge all underscore the harsh truth that virtue often carries tremendous sacrifice. Yet Tolkien frames this sacrifice as meaningful. The ultimate survival of the Three Rings and the enduring hope they embodied validates the risks taken and the suffering endured. Ultimately, the aftermath of Celebrimbor's defiance demonstrates the interweaving of loss and preservation, destruction and survival.
The ruins of Eregion, the scattered smiths, and the hidden three rings illustrate that even in the wake of devastation, foresight, courage, and moral integrity can create ripples that influence generations. Celebrimbor's story in this phase is both tragic and heroic, a testament to the enduring power of craft, conscience, and the unseen effects of principled action. And yet, while the consequences of his choices were profound, one question lingered. What became of Celebrimbor himself? His personal fate remains one of Tolkien's deepest enigmas, a silence that both haunts and elevates his story. It is in this void, in the space between history and legend, that the enduring mystery of Middle-earth takes shape.
Celebrimbor's story is one of brilliance and silence. His work, his resistance, and his ethical mastery created ripples that would shape Middle-earth for centuries. Yet his personal fate remained unresolved, suspended in the shadow between history and legend. The survival of the Three Rings ensured that Elvish realms could endure, that light could persist even under the growing shadow of Sauron. Through these artifacts, his influence continued to guide and protect long after his voice fell silent. In Tolkien's legendarium, the Three Rings are more than instruments of power. They are vessels of moral vision, physical embodiments of foresight, restraint, and the conviction that creation must be protected from corruption. The enduring mystery of Celebrimbor's fate has captivated scholars and readers alike precisely because it defies closure. Did he fall screaming in Sauron's dungeons, or was his broken body displayed as a warning? Did he survive in some hidden corner, or did he perish utterly, leaving only the rings as testimony to his genius? Tolkien's deliberate ambiguity elevates the narrative beyond biography into philosophical terrain. Celebrimbor becomes a symbol of the unseen consequences of courage, the hidden costs of ethical action, and the fragile persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. His disappearance asks questions about heroism itself. Must it be witnessed to have value? Can the ultimate act of creation, preservation under duress, exist independently of recognition? Culturally, Celebrimbor's legacy shaped the identity of the Elves and the free peoples of Middle-earth. His story became a touchstone for understanding the relationship between skill, morality, and responsibility. The Gwaith-i-Mírdain, even in diaspora, carried his techniques, principles, and cautionary lessons. Rivendell, Lothlorien, and other Elvish strongholds inherited not only his craftsmanship, but the ethical framework within which that craft could serve good rather than domination. Tolkien repeatedly underscores that knowledge and power are inseparable from responsibility, a lesson embodied in Celebrimbor's life and choices. Philosophically, Celebrimbor's story explores the interplay between creation and corruption, knowledge and restraint, courage and sacrifice. His genius alone was not enough to safeguard Middle-earth. It was his foresight, his ethical commitment, and his moral courage under unimaginable pressure that preserved hope. This dynamic resonates across Tolkien's works. The greatest talents are both a gift and a test, and mastery untempered by conscience can become a conduit for evil. Celebrimbor's resistance under torture, his careful forging of the Three Rings, and his ultimate disappearance exemplify this principle. Perhaps that is the final power of Celebrimbor's story, that even in death or disappearance, he remains an enigma. His life and choices shaped the destiny of Middle-earth, yet his personal fate resists comprehension. In the void left by his absence, readers are compelled to confront questions about courage, morality, the nature of heroism, and the unseen ripples of principled action. Celebrimbor's story endures because it transcends mere narrative. It is a meditation on mastery, ethics, and the enduring tension between light and shadow. And so, we are left with one of Tolkien's most haunting mysteries, the unsolved fate of Celebrimbor.
Middle-earth's lost smith? What do you believe happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold mysteries of Middle-earth, our deep dive into the creation and beginning of the Elves is waiting for you. Don't miss it.